sound is in the room. So that's what I was afraid of. Okay. Okay, so I put this up because I find it interesting. Right now we have 34 countries that Google claims to be accessing it using IPv6. Vietnam and Austria are among the most recent additions to that list. I just find the growth over time interesting. So that's why I put that up there. Lee, you want to talk about administrative?
Where we're starting. Hey, this is who we are and where we are. If you came to a different working group, you're in the wrong room. Here's our agenda. We have a moment for bashing the agenda. Are there any changes that anybody feels the need to call for? Very good. Hearing none. Next item is actually we're still on that slide. No, that's right. I have a separate one for that. Okay. Noting well. This, you saw this when you registered, and you've seen it before. But I always like to call attention to it in ways that other people mostly don't. When you speak here, you are making a contribution to the IETF. That is an IETF contribution. We appreciate that. It's part of the official record. Noted well. So I asked a little while ago on the mailing list, and I asked a little while ago for minute takers, and we're stuck until we have at least one, but preferably two people who will agree to take notes. It's easy to do. You can do it in the Etherpad. If two people do it, then you can help each other spell people's names. I'm looking for somebody. I see, sorry, who's over there? Okay, so we've got, and did I see another hand in the back? Please, I see somebody else in the back saying yes, they would take minutes. There's one. I can't see who it is, but yes, now we have two people who volunteered to take minutes. Again, I like the Etherpad from the V6OPS data tracker page because then you can work together. We need somebody who's going to be on Jabber who can relay notes to and from Jabber. A very easy job. Works over V6. I will even be here backing you up, but I can't make it my job. Thank you, Chris. And that's where the slides are. Good.
Okay, cool. So let me walk through just for a minute kind of the things we go through in thinking about agendas and such. And I'm pointing on problems. Bring the mic over where people can hear me. Okay. So at this instant, you can see there we have two drafts in working group last call. I have an unupdated working group document. I have an updated working group drop document that came in at 4:59 a few seconds. I mean, literally just under the wire. And then I've got kind of a number of other documents. So the chairs in figuring out what's here look at what we see commentary on the mailing list. If the working group isn't interested, we don't really try to talk about it. And we do try to pick up things that get traction. When we get very, very late submissions, it's kind of hard for us to figure out the agenda. And so we actually have a couple of drafts this time that came in just under the wire, and we're not going to have, we couldn't fit into the agenda. So we may want to have an interim meeting. I'll have a discussion about that later in order to kind of discuss late drafts. But please, when you're thinking that you're on the hook to put in a draft or you would like to put in a draft, getting it in 2 or 3 weeks in advance and giving the working group time to read it, comment on it, say they don't like it, whatever. That I think it's good for the working group, and it makes life easier for the chairs. So please, and Lee actually already showed you the agenda, so I'll not show you the agenda again. One discussion that I want to have has to do with our charter. Now, what I've observed, you might remember when we had the Beijing IETF and we had 43 drafts in a 5-hour slot on a Friday afternoon. We have had times when we've had a whole lot of work to sort through and so on and so forth. The last couple of IETFs, last few meetings, we've been at a relatively low work group phase. And one of the things that I'm interested in is essentially reinvigorating the working group and retargeting what we're doing toward things that are of interest to current operators. And I have some ideas along that line, but who knows? I could be wrong. Now, if I look at what's going on in the great wide world, I've got 5 or 6 companies here that have put up blogs in which they're saying they either are IPv6 only or they are moving in the direction of IPv6 only operation. If I look at Hurricane Electric's analysis of the BGP route table, they say there are 321 today autonomous systems that are only advertising an IPv6 prefix, which to me, that's interesting. And then also from the Hurricane Electric report, there are so many of the Alexa million networks that are advertising V4 prefixes and so many that are advertising V6 prefixes. Doing the math, I come up with about 28,000, roughly 28,000 autonomous systems that are only advertising IPv6 prefixes. Okay, or I'm sorry, 28,000 prefixes that are names that are IPv6 only. And which, okay, I'm seeing some motion in the industry in the direction of IPv6 only operation. And I'm sure a lot of it is experimental, but it is what it is. And I wonder if we as a working group should be talking about that. So I'm suggesting a charter update in which we would explicitly invite, in addition to whatever else we've been working on, invite discussion of IPv6 only operation from whoever might be doing it. I see at least one nodding head. Okay, second issue, and I noticed this really kind of triggered for me following an email conversation maybe a month ago. I've been thinking about it for a while, but it suddenly the penny dropped. If I look at the agenda, the first 2 drafts that we're going to be discussed have essentially the same title. They're discussing router requirements. And in asking the working group for commentary on one of those 2 drafts, we got a comment back from James Whittiett at Google, who said, well, this particular draft doesn't discuss routing and therefore isn't interesting to me. Peeling a little bit further back, turned out that he was interested in HNCP routing. And the draft that he was complaining about came from LinkedIn. Well, you know what? LinkedIn isn't going to run HNCP, and nor would I expect it to. They're going to be running BGP. But HNCP is certainly important in certain environments. And it occurred to me, it's been occurring to me, that when we first built MCP in 1970 or thereabouts, it was described, if you go read the early RFCs, it was described as a host-to-host interface, and the network was kind of invisible. If I look at IPv4, we suddenly started talking about routing protocols, and we admitted to the existence of the network. And we started talking about how one managed the network and what one might do with the network. And looking at the distinction between those 2 drafts and James' comment, it occurs to me at this point we have some very different kinds of networks that have different requirements. We have broadband ISPs, we have transit ISPs, which Jeff Houston claims no longer need to exist. We have content providers, people running data centers, we have the Internet of Things, we have all, and Jeff, I just took your name in vain. We have all sorts of different networks and they have different requirements. And I'm wondering if we as a working group should say that out loud and start thinking about, okay, so what are my requirements or what are the requirements in some particular place? What are common requirements? What are specific to some particular area? So now, the proposed charter update, what you're looking at, I'm sorry, I'm a terrible person. I did this in a Microsoft product. Using track changes, you can see the proposed changes there to our existing working group charter. And what I'm targeting in that is that first change. Adding a bullet, basically inviting IPv6 only operation, and then wordsmithing the introductory text to say IPv4 is still important, but we really need to be talking about IPv6 and networks that are charging down that path. So now question, I sent this out to the list and I got exactly one comment from Spain, Catalunya. And I want a sense of the working group. Do you support that change to the charter? Is that a reasonable thing to do? Kim? Kim, are you running to the mic?
Hi, Tim Chang. Yeah, I like this. I think it's a really good thing to do. In my role, I speak to other UK universities quite a lot, and the ones deploying IPv6 are by default doing dual stack, but they would very much like to be able to run just one protocol. But they know at the moment that's not necessarily quite feasible. So they're very interested in knowing how to get to that point. So this would be great.
Okay. So Joel?
Yeah, Joel Yeagley. So one thing I'd observe is that like the impact of this shift in focus doesn't necessarily mean that all the work that will be done there will be associated with the networks that want to run V6 only. So some of the things that we did in the process of providing coverage to our enterprises while deploying dual stack, i.e. to ensure that we didn't have unintended consequences for our V4 users, like having V4 only authoritative name servers, even though we have dual stack services, like are things that actually have to be undone or matured even in our dual stack environments to support V6 only environments. And so, yeah, I think there is transition work that even enterprises that provide V6 only or V6 available services today need to do in order to support those networks, and that's sort of contributing to the long-term maturity of V6 service as a product that we offer to our customers.
Okay. Let me take a hum on this, and this is really just the first question, which is IPv6 only operation. Folks who support this change to the charter, would you please hum? Folks who think it's a terrible idea and want to fire me as a chair, please hum. Abstain? Okay. Fine. So we'll do that. Now, I haven't edited in here anything about markets, but what do you think about this question of markets? Should I edit something into the charter? Is that something that we would simply like to leave floating in the air and people can propose drafts? How would you like to approach that? Does anyone have a comment?
Tim Chance, if you were going to add one sentence about that, what would it be? Do you have a specific thing in mind, or?
well, I might take my little canonical list of markets and say, the list of markets includes these, it's not limited to these. But that we would encourage discussions of IPv6 operation in those markets.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that as I am with V6 only, although I was just sat in the working group chair's lunch when we were talking about how we make clear the relevance of the IETF to other people. So that certainly ticks that box, but I'm not so sure.
Jordi Palet. I tried the last few days to think about what is the difference between market and scenarios, and I really have tough time to realize that. So maybe until we don't write down some text, I don't think we have a clear idea about that.
Okay, so I'm not sure there is a difference. I'm using different language, but I think I mean the same thing. So, Eric?
Eric Lynn, is there some text in the charter that you feel precludes doing this, or you just want to be more explicit about it? Is that?
I'm thinking we should be more explicit about it. Okay, if I look at RFC 1812, I look at various documents that have proposed to be something like that for the next generation, it really only thinks in terms of ISPs and hosts. And I think a lot of the more difficult discussions that we wind up having on the mailing list are people saying, in my market, it's important to me to do this. And then somebody else saying, in my market, that would be a stupid thing to do. I'm like, well, in his market, it probably is, but the discussion's over here. And questioning whether we can kind of take the heat out of those discussions by saying, well, yeah, that's your market, that's his market.
I think it's certainly good to have everybody in the room who wants to discuss all manner of operating IPv6 things at all layers. In all scenarios. I don't know that you could produce an exhaustive list that wouldn't end with et cetera.
I think that would have to be there.
So I don't.
So Warren Kamari, I don't think there's anything that precludes anything like that. But the first bullet, V6 Internet, sort of, kind of, if you look at it funny, implies more ISP stuff. So just changing that to network kind of changes the tone slightly. I have no strong views on whether you should list different environments or markets or whatever.
Changing this word. Bullet 1. So like that? Okay, and that works for me. John?
Hi, Fred. John Brzezowski, Comcast. So I think one of the things that we're looking at here in this, and I had a conversation with Aaliyah the other day about some stuff that we're talking about in like the routing area, providing some context. There's projects that we're looking at in this space that kind of transcend different types of segments, right? Frankly, I think the marketizing this is probably overkill, right? I mean, it seems to me like they're pretty uniform problems, right? How do you manage a router? How do you get telemetry from it? What is it? Maybe you can get to a point, at some point, where you can differentiate what different routers do in different circumstances. I think that one of the things we'll talk about with Rust is the draft doing with Rust is just basic blocking and tackling things that really are that we need to tackle as a community, right? So I think it's probably more important for us to get to work, right, than it is to figure out if we need to bucketize this more. It feels like it could elongate the process unnecessarily, right? So there are things out there that we need to start looking at.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to cap the line after Mark.
I'm James Woodyard, Google. I was name checked. So I'm here to basically say I don't see any particular need to change the charter to explicitly mention markets or anything like that. And if you just want to leave it floating out there as something that we always deal with, because we always have, that'd be fine with me. I don't see. Okay. I don't particularly want to be the guy that said, this is why we have to do this.
It's all your fault, you know that. But
it's always my fault.
Okay, Mark?
just careful, if you change one IPv6 networks, you need to also change it into IPv4 internet. We don't want to assume that there's an IPv4 internet, but not a V6 internet. And Tim Chone, with the mother tongue of Queen's English, said networking might work better here than networks. I don't know. But this is getting wordsmiths. I just want to make sure you don't miss the second bullet.
Yeah. Okay, thank you much. Okay, so I'm hearing that there isn't support for the markets question, and that's fine. So I'm going to send you this, and your new boss. Yeah, okay, fine. Okay, so with that, router requirements. You're here? Okay, cool. So, probably wouldn't hurt. Oh, you was asking if I need to send the charter document back out to the mailing list, which I will, but for a week.
Oh, so you fixed the typo. That was good. So, so I am channeling Russ. He has a conflict in somewhere else at the moment. So this should be short and sweet. Hopefully, have a little bit of discussion, get some feedback from you guys. But there's a draft that we're working on for router requirements. We wanted to really, coincidentally, between Comcast and LinkedIn, we were talking about very similar problems just casually that we were kind of confronting together at separate companies. Again, to go to the comment we made a few minutes ago about markets, LinkedIn and Comcast come from pretty different parts of kind of the ecosystem here. So interestingly, we found a lot of commonality without actually having to do anything magical to make that happen. So we are talking about the idea of, as we kind of embark on this transition, where we've introduced support for V6, we're now talking about really the kind of the removal of V4 support, right? So we have work that's going on inside of Comcast where we have V6 only backbone being built, where we're looking at very different operational models around how this infrastructure is going to be operated. So we really want to take advantage of that point in time to really encourage change and really provide a series of suggestions to help people understand what it would look like to operate a network that is V6 only from like literally the day you take it out of the packaging, right? I won't kind of go through all these, line by line, but the review of the organization document, the review of the architecture, management security, so things like Telnet, SSH, SNMP, what have you. There's some new topics that we're looking at. Is this blue button there?
No, there's no pointer on that.
Sorry, Fred. Thanks. So there's some new stuff that we're looking at. New twists to old concepts like zero-touch provisioning. Some of the stuff that we're looking at, internally is using Slack and RDNSS as ways for devices to basically automatically acquire an address. Today, a lot of that is DHCP based. The DHCP4 is everywhere. We see V6 popping up, but we want to look at different ways to go ahead and do that. And of course, there's a lot of security considerations there, DDoS, etc. Continuing along, telemetry. I mean, everybody in the room who kind of logs into a router and just tries to troubleshoot something, everything from show interface statistics to SNMP traps and walks, etc. But we're also looking at different ways to go ahead and do that. So instead of having to ask the box questions, have the box always telling us what some information about itself, right? So trying to look at new ways to do that. And of course, we want all that to be done by default over V6. Forwarding and addressing, I think a lot of the work in this space, you'll find, we've all had to encounter and tackle over the past few years turning on V6 because we couldn't have turned it on without actually having some of these things taken care of, whether it's, the handling of, MTU or ICMPv6 considerations for rate limiting and what have you. So I think there's probably some things in this section that would be familiar to a lot of the work that we've done, kind of just in passing over the years. But there's more to be done here. Like, for example, MTU is a big one that we're talking about on our, as Jeff laughs, that we've been talking about internally because we want to take advantage of the possibilities of larger MTUs and the features of V6 that we think we can leverage there. I think up until now, it's really been making sure that we don't break anything, right? But this is really looking to advance the state of the art. Some future considerations, we're talking about segment routing, robustness and security. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done in that space. Then, of course, conclusion. Then we're going to talk about some next steps. I confess I'll defer to the guys behind me to see where the current state of the current kind of thinking is here. But I understand from, talking to Russ before coming here, there were some data, some questions or comments around possibly multiple documents, what have you. But we would like to obviously have the document accepted as a working group document. And I think I'll leave it at that, ask some questions, get your feedback, and then figure out where we go from here.
Okay, Q&A. How many people have read the document? I see a number of hands. Okay.
Hi, Tim Chan. I've got sort of two small sets of questions. One is based on the fact that Tim and John and I are updating RFC 6434, the node requirement, so trying to keep it in sync with this draft. The good news there is, having looked through it, there's only one section where there's any significant difference, so that's, I think, good news there. So the comment from that's section 3.3, where in your draft you say Slack should be enabled by default on all router interfaces, not a must. Is that definitely a should or a must, or is it?
So I think it should be a must as well, for what it's worth. So I'll talk to Russ and
Okay,
the other authors.
that's good. And also Slack should be able to be disabled. I guess that should be a must as well, or should it not?
So I have a dumb question sticking in here. I had lunch with Xing Li, and Xing Li had exactly the opposite comment, that in his network he didn't want anyone running Slack. So now what is this dealing with? Is it dealing with the default, or is it dealing with?
I think there's a couple of things. There's whether it's linked local or globals as well. So if you look in 6434 current, the one we haven't updated, it says routers must be able to generate linked local addresses. So it doesn't say anything about global addresses. Is that?
Yeah, that was Tim Winter-Chywell. That was really my question, if we could distinguish between link local Slack and global Slack. Obviously, routers with global Slack, it really only applies to.
So I'll ask the embarrassing question. Like, is this in an email somewhere?
And I think it's going to be.
Yeah. Okay. So if you don't mind, I think you're generally very sane, right? So
just generally, that's okay.
both of you guys are actually quite sane.
Okay, we'll pop an email.
Love to. We can work through these things. It's really.
So
they all sound pretty reasonable to me, right?
Okay,
so like the Slack comment, the one thing I'll make is, if it's on by default, it means it's supported. If you send it an 8-bit that's still set to 0, you effectively turn it off, right? So the administrator of the network still arguably has control in that regard, right? So we can work through some of those nuances together, right? But I think the meta statement I'll make there is it should be on by default, right? Right now, I had to do all sorts of unnatural stuff to actually make something like Slack look like it's working, right? It's all
okay. Good. Well, okay. Stepping up a bit, I think overall the document, having read through it, I think it reads really well. I like the first two sections on more about the sort of philosophy, if you like. I think that reads really nicely. I think just the second part of my question is there's a couple of things that you might want to think about adding. One would be comments about MLD version 2, for example, if it's a router-based thing, whether that should be a must. I would argue it must be a must. And the other one was on our DNSS options in RAs. It'd be nice if we could make bigger encouragement for that to happen.
We're going to, I mean, my work hat on, we require it to be on, right?
Okay.
We need the address and that.
So if that would be a must as well, that would be great.
Scott, I mean, how's it going to work, right? We're going to hard code an address for something to phone home to, like on every box? Dude, that's not going to work.
Well, those things aren't in there now, but I think it'd be great to add them. So I'll put it in.
What do you think about, so with DNS, what do you think about well-known FQDNs and things like that? So like if you're a router now, and if you're trying to move from a pull methodology from a push, right? Because today you bring up a router, you plug in the terminal port, you paste a bunch of crap into the terminal and say, that I plug in that I paste the right config into the right router, right? Have you contemplated the possibility where the router just comes online with Slack, has DNS server IP and a DNS search list, and it says, I will phone home to configuration.foo, and I'm just going to try to, I want to post a generic URL to kind of fetch my configuration.
Absolutely. That kind of fits in with what we heard about provisioning domains in whatever group that was yesterday.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah. I loosely put that, Tim, into the ZTP 6 bucket, right?
Yeah.
Tim Winters, UNHIOL. So two things. One is I really like this document. It was easy to read. The only other thing Tim stole most of my thunder is MLD v2 would be something you're probably going to want to clarify. And we have all kinds of issues with that inside the lab at the IOL. So that might be something you guys want to, and then I was going to ask about the DNS RA thing, which is not in there now. So you're going to plan to put that in there?
Yeah, we'll talk to Russ.
Okay.
Make sure you send it by mail and thank Russ. He did all the work.
Okay.
Ron Bonica, Juniper Networks, and Hatless at the moment. First, I support the draft. It was good work, easy reading. 2 questions, one general, one specific. The general one, some of the requirements here are clearly V6 specific. They belong in the document. Some of them aren't so V6 specific. They apply equally to V4 and V6 routers. Now the question is, do you want to go there? When you address the ones that are generic, I'm thinking of like SSH access or telnet should be disabled. If you go there, it expands the scope of the document and it might turn into a much bigger document than you want it to be.
I don't do V4.
Okay. You might want to think about whether that document,
Dude,
want to be here.
I'm not here to fix V4, man.
Okay. Next issue is around the section with MTU and jumbograms. You have a section that's enabled MTU and jumbograms, but it does not mention jumbograms at all. This might be a good place to start talking about the fact that nobody does jumbograms. And maybe it's time to start the funeral for jumbograms.
Or not. Right?
You're not starting.
We'll make it work, right? That's what this is, right? So you're talking about like large packets, right?
Yeah, packets bigger than 65K.
That's right. Right. So
You have no text in that section about jumbograms at all.
so we'll get back to that.
Oh, I'm sorry, no. Oh, not the ones with the extension header to show?
So which one? So you're talking about like, so we're talking about like really like 4K, 8K, 9K packets?
Oh, when I read that header, jumbo frames, I was thinking of the ones that need the extension header because they're so large that
So
the packet length.
I'll circle back with Russ after this today, and I'll confer with him. But if you don't mind, send us a mail to the office.
Yeah, it's on. I sent it a week ago.
Yeah, it's in my folder.
Okay.
It's in my.
Oh, that's not what he's talking about in that. Okay, got it.
Yeah, that mail's probably my. That mail got auto filtered probably.
Hi, James Woodyard, Google again. So 2 things. One, I think the reason I got a little confused about this document when it first showed up is that I was really I found it when I was looking for a document that talked about general purpose router requirements, but this one seemed to have a lot of focus on routers that are managed by professional operators. And that's not all routers, as we know, but it's an important category. I get that. So one suggestion might be maybe put something in the title or in the abstract that says, we're talking a lot about this particular category of routers so that people like me don't get so quickly confused. And the second comment.
Can I ask a question, James, real quick? So sure. Largely intended to differentiate from that of a home network, for example?
For example, but I don't want to say that home networks are the only ones that are unmanaged. I think this is probably closely related to this phrase that I'm not sure I know exactly what it means, the zero-touch provisioning, right? You know, I think that these managed operator routers are growing more and more autonomous as they come along. But
I might ask you for some help to kind of make sure that whatever text we craft to kind of help differentiate, is.
I don't think I'm really asking for like a major change, just something so
I know
that people like me don't get confused.
Yeah.
And the second thing that I just thought of when I was in the back of the room when I was watching your presentation was a lot of these routers have, I guess they're called ACLs that are, in my head, they're like, oh, this is like a firewall. It's a thing that is configuring the router to drop packets if they don't match some category, right? And I wonder if those ACLs should be subject to something like port control protocol. And if a requirement might be named that says that, routers that have ACLs ought to have port control protocol servers in them, and they should have port control protocol proxies so that you can chain all of the crazy ACLs together and everything associated with the whole PCP infrastructure that talks about how hosts discover PCP servers and all of that. Is that something that you thought about?
Yeah. personally, I have an opinion pertaining to that. I don't necessarily see the need for PCP that dynamically, meaning the explicit need for PCP itself. I see the need for the solution that the problem that you're describing, right? The ability to kind of manage those apples, perhaps have a set of defaults, and then have a way. So this one for me kind of overlaps with zero-touch provisioning, right? So once a router comes online, as long as it comes online in secure fashion, and then you can get keys to it, you can do other things, and then you now have a bidirectional channel to be able to manage the router. You could argue, might PCP be one of those tools? Yeah.
I guess what I mean is that if routers are going to be put into a mode where they are blocking all unsolicited inbound flows, even by default, then there ought to be a PCP server in there. What's good for residential gateways, because we say that in RFC 7084, what's good for them ought to be good for every router, right? There should be a PCP server so that passive listeners on hosts that are passively listening for inbound flows, they can actually signal the network, yes, I really am listening, and I'd like a lease on this port or whatever it is. And if we don't want that requirement, then I'd like to see this draft say, yeah, we're not going to require that.
Or outline an alternate way to go ahead and do it. So let me steal on that. I hadn't pondered PCP. I'll get back to you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, so a quick request. If you're sitting next to an empty chair, could you put your hand up? We have a number of people standing in the back that could perhaps use a chair. Okay. Request, if you have comments on the draft, would you please send an email to the list and preferably include text. Please change this to that or add this or whatever it is that you're requesting. Dave.
So line cut, or can I ask a quick question? Okay. So one of the comments, this is Dave Taylor, one of the comments did resonate with me, which was to be more clear as to whether this would apply to CPE routers, because we do have the basic requirement, 6204, I think it is, I have it up on my screen, which right now is not even referenced informatively. And it would be good to clarify, is this to encompass that or to not encompass it, in which case is 6204 normative or an informative is saying it's out of scope and see 6204 instead for this other case, and just adding some text about that. And I think the suggestion was, if it is not supposed to apply to CPE, edge routers, then putting a word in the title just like 6204 did that's in between IPv6 and router in the title.
That's fair. It's a fair request. Understood.
So yeah, make your market clear, but we won't talk about market.
The point is clarify the reference to 6204.
Okay, cool. Okay, so John wants to have this taken up as a working group draft, and let me take opinions. I've heard a number of supportive comments. Are people generally supportive of the direction the draft is going? Hum if yes. Yeah. Okay. Now hum if no. Okay. So I'll send it. We will send an email to the list saying, do you guys want to take this up to the working group draft? And we'll give you a week to go noodle on that, but we'll come back on that.
Thanks.
Okay. So thank you much, John.
Okay. Well, when I work with customers, I have customers which are big ISPs, medium, and small, and I most of the time, especially the medium ones and the small ones, have big problems trying to find vendors that deliver the CPs that need the protocols that they really need to support IPv6 in their network. So basically, what we have is the big ISPs that can push the vendors and request them, please do this for me, and they have no problem. But if the smaller or medium ISPs need to go to the market or even buy 10 units every week in the shop nearby, they cannot get what they need. Okay, so that's the basic reason I started this work. I also asked vendors, actually I did the question to the representatives in Spain. I talked with about 12, 11 different vendors, TP-Link, ASUS, and D-Link, and other similar ones. If they have different products for different markets or different, let's say, customers, and typically the answer was no. But what we do sometimes is exactly what I just mentioned. They customize sometimes for big customers the firmware that is inside the router. Okay, what is the market reality regarding IPv4? Is even if the ISPs are trying to deploy IPv6, they still need to deliver IPv4, I mean dual stack, inside of the customer LANs. Okay, so they could, of course, do a deployment with IPv6 only in the access network, but they still have the need to be dual stack inside of the customer. Okay, they have basically two options. One is DS Lite with carrier grade NAT, or a similar one which is lightweight 4/6, or they could go for, let's say, newer protocols like the ones that are being used in cellular networks, 464X-LAT or MAP-T, MAP-E. But what happens actually is that vendors are not supporting those protocols. Okay, so they don't really have the power, especially for medium and small ISPs, to go into that direction. When some of these ISPs go to the vendors, and I remember one from Latin America and one from Europe that already mentioned this in the V6OPS list, the vendors say, we are not supporting that because the document that we use as a reference in the IETF is not asking for that. It's only asking for 6RD and DS Lite. So this is reality. Looking at the reality in the code, well, if you look for one of the most common, let's say, open source implementation, there are others, which is OpenWRT. The successor of OpenWRT now is LEDE. They are supporting this protocol since, I believe, most of them early 2015. I have compared how much it cost in terms of code to implement, in addition to DS Lite, all the other protocols, and it's about 10, 12 kilobytes of memory. Okay, so if you look at the total average cost of the flash that is booting up the router, it means it's 0.15% of the total. So it's not a real problem to, in actual hardware, say, let's increase the number of protocols, transition protocols that we are going to support. Why? Because most of them have a lot of code in common. For example, the translation mechanisms between IPv4 and IPv6 are the same in all the protocols. When you are doing map encapsulation is the same as 6in4, etc., etc. So basically, all the code is already there. Okay, this is the same for DS Lite versus lightweight 4/6, because what you are basically doing is the NAT functionality, instead of doing it in the CGN, you are again doing it in the NAT box in the CP that already has NAT 4.4. Okay. So there is no extra cost in terms of hardware to support new protocols. There is no extra cost in developing the code. There are different open source implementations. Of course, you will need to integrate in your platform, but looking at the actual code base for most of the vendors, they are using Linux boxes. So it means the source code is there. Okay, they can take from open source and they can integrate in their existing platform. I look at also into the market which vendors are actually supporting 464X-LAT and MAP, and there are only 3. 2 of them are in Japan. They are very expensive, and when you ask them for a quote for 10,000 units, they even don't respond. Okay, so they are looking only for really big ISPs, like I am going to buy 100,000 units every year or something like that. I did that for real customers, and even having a serious order in the hand, they say, we are not going to deliver, it's too small, okay? They have the product, but they are not interested in selling small quantities. Well, this is a small quantity for them, of course. And again, I checked it with some vendors, and they confirmed that they are supporting more protocols on the request for big orders, for big ISPs. Now, this is something that it was not in the previous version of the document, and it came out as part of the discussion in the mailing list. I was trying to think what is the scenario or the market or whatever we want to call where we want to use this document. Okay, so I think I come out to this 6 categories. Some of them are very obvious. Residential customers, they just want regular internet access. In most of the cases, this is exactly the same if you have a small home office, obviously. Then if you go to just the small home office, obviously it's also the same. So we have 3 categories which are exactly the same. And now we go to small and medium enterprises. Well, if you go to the political or economical definition of a small, medium enterprises, it can change from region to region. But for example, they have a definition for micro enterprise, which is up to 10 employees. And then there is another definition, which is SME, which is up to 250 employees. Most of the routers that we have today in our homes, perfectly in terms of capability of power and even considering what is the bandwidth that connects to your ISP will work for most of these enterprises, okay? If they are just doing browsing, emailing, and things like that. So what is the different thing then? Well, it comes if you consider a professional or an enterprise that in his local area network want to export some services. Like, for example, he want to have their own servers for web, for email, DNS, and things like that. Okay, that's basically the only difference. Again, I am not looking into medium, big enterprises where they may need 10 gig ports or things like that. Okay, I am looking into the average small user, a small enterprise, which maybe 100, maybe 200 users, maybe they have just 300 megabits connectivity, maybe even less than that. So the CP don't need a lot of power in terms of forwarding capability, okay? Now, we look to these advanced requirements, and I have here some question marks because at the end, if we want to export services like web servers or email or DNS, if you look to the actual IPv4 routers that we all have at our home, they do that. You can actually do DMZ or virtual servers or port forwarding or things like that. So in terms of IPv4, it's already supported, okay? It's nothing new. In terms of IPv6, and of course, in terms of IPv4, need to be supported because we are using NAT, okay? So it's a different perspective. In terms of IPv6, there is nothing new to be supported because if you are using global unicast addresses, it's there, okay? I am not here considering the firewall capabilities. It's in another slide, and that's part of the security considerations in the document, which I am not changing at the moment. Okay, so this is basically at the end, when we look at the scenarios, I started thinking we have basically 2 categories, 1 to 4 and then 5 and 6. And then I look here and I say, hey, we don't really have 6 different categories. It's all about the same, at least for this small router, okay? Now, one of the questions that come to the mailing list is, do we need to have 1 or several documents? and this is related to what I just said in the last couple of slides. The router described in this document is obviously, and I think it's made clear in the document, and if not, we will need to make it more obvious, not intended for scenarios like data centers, content providers, or things like that, okay? It's a small router. I don't want to say home router anymore because it can be SME, et cetera, et cetera. Even if the documented requirements meet the needs for some of those different scenarios, they are out of the scope of the document. I think that need to be clear. Maybe the difference is just the number of users that you support, because maybe you need a lot of extra RAM for DHCP or whatever if you have 1,000 users, okay? Maybe it's in terms of hardware capabilities like CPU, flash memory to support routing protocols, number of interfaces, speed of the interfaces, type of interfaces, and so on. Maybe that's the difference if you go to bigger routers. And well, if you look for cost for these devices, you have devices which multiple cores, a lot of flash, a lot of RAM for $50, okay, or even less than that. I think it was right before this session, talking with someone, we were talking about, well, a home router or a semi-router probably needs support for wireless, but maybe an enterprise router not, because they have a complete set of access points in the network and so on. So that may be a different something different, but this is actually something included in the number of interfaces and type of them. So another consideration is the intent of the original document was only IPv6 CPs, okay? But at the end, we started incorporating some transition mechanisms. So we have two paths right now, I think. Or we revert the current document to support only IPv6 and we don't talk about any IPv4 support, or we update the document and we update it with the support for the actual transition mechanisms that are going to be used and are already being used in the actual networks. I think that's the two possibilities that we have, right? I think it's made clear in the document, in case anyone has not read that, and that was already clear in the previous versions of the document, that the intent of the document is the IPv6 support. And IPv4 is an extra, and the transition mechanisms are needed to be supported if you have IPv4 support. So in the future, if you really need an IPv6 only router, the document is still the same, okay? I think that is clear and maybe still be available. So what are the changes that I have done in the document? Well, the first one was including the usage, I call it usage scenarios, describing what I have talked about in the last slides. Then in the LAN, the support for home network control protocol. I think in home networking, this is something that need to be obvious. There was some debate in the list. At the moment, I have included it. Let's see what is the outcome of that. And then the support for 464 XLAT, MAP-T, MAP-E, 6-in-4, which is implicit with 6RD. So if you are supporting 6RD, the support for 6-in-4 is there already. In fact, most of the routers that support 6RD, you configure them and lie them with the 6-in-4 parameters, they work. So it's nothing to change. And lightweight 4/6. Open questions. Should explicitly ask for IPv6 firewall on by default. The actual document is referring to RFC 6092. Is that enough, or we want for home routers to be on by default? This is something that it comes very often again and again. Okay, I am not taking a decision on this. I am just opening the question. Barbara, you want to comment on that?
Barbara Stark, sure, if I can do so without tripping and falling. No. I mean, currently the requirement for support of 6092 is only a should, and it should remain a should. And I think James would agree with me. And the reason for that, I can actually give a reason, is in AT&T, we actually ship routers where we fully expect the customers to put their own router beyond our router, and we specifically do not have any 6092 support in this box.
Okay.
And that is a valid use case, and it shall continue to be a valid use case.
Okay. So
That
next
was the
steps,
requirement language.
I discovered the last couple of days a couple of editorial corrections, so I will correct that. And the thing that I explained about the cost in terms of memory and so on, I explained this in the mailing list, but I didn't realize that it would be a good idea to have this explanation in the draft itself. So I am planning to add that in the draft. I think it's good because it's a good argument or a good counter argument for the vendors that say, hey, I cannot do that because it cost me 1 meg of memory or whatever. Okay, so it's a good counter argument, I think. And that's it.
Mukam Taman from Avrinik. Thank you very much for your draft. I've got, would you consider putting within the document a provision that those transition mechanisms be able to, say, fail gracefully when they're no longer needed? Because since the objective is to get native IPv6 at the end, we might want to avoid the situation where there's native IPv6 and then lots of these other protocols still turned on. Would it be something you would consider putting in the document?
So say again, you mean?
So for example, you've got different types of transition mechanisms as requirements. So they could be on. I think that we should consider specifying that at some point when there's native IPv6, these things turn off gracefully, considering that the audience is not an audience that can go into the router and switch these things off.
So you mean a way to turn them off?
Yes.
Or
that you should turn off.
Well, if you don't have IPv4 traffic in the LAN, it's not being used. I don't think there is a need to turn it off. And in some of the cases, the provisioning from the ISP can already turn it off. Okay.
Okay, so that's handled by the ISP.
Yeah.
Okay.
And most of the transition mechanisms described actually require native IPv6 to exist, and they run over native IPv6. I think that's part of what he's trying to add is more that do that. So turning them off when if you turn them off when you get native IPv6, then of course you wouldn't have the transition mechanism at all. Because you're using it to have IPv4 work now.
Hans Liu from D-Link. Well, you mentioned that many small ISPs doesn't have the bargaining power to have the vendor like us to have the customized for those small ISPs. However, I really don't see how you gonna benefit the IPv6, how you gonna promote IPv6 by adding those transition features. As I mean, like we have 6204, we have 7084, we have IPv6 day LAN, IPv6 work for so many years. However, I don't really see how many vendors, especially the home router vendors, actually following and certified their routers in like UNHIL for the program. And I really believe that the reason why we put basic requirement is like we want it to be a basic requirement so the IPv6 can be easily implemented by all the vendors and speed up the market for the IPv6.
The point here is that when this document was developed, some of these mechanisms didn't exist, and probably some of these mechanisms are better in some situations, maybe not in others. The other question was, I was asking in the mailing list, we want to get rid of the support, for example, of 6RT or DS Lite, and the answer was not, keep them, because some of us started using that already.
Yeah, but I mean that many vendors, in my understanding, that many vendors doesn't do or doesn't follow the RFC because they basically still based on a tender project. ISP by ISP. Every different customer has different requirements, and that's the reason why we should not have just like by putting everything into it. Like 16.4, we have 16.4 like in 10, 20 years ago. However, really anybody deploy that in the current market, as so far as in my understanding, I don't have a lot of RFQs for that requirement.
But you are right. But you are right for big ISPs that do tenders, but the small ISPs don't do, and that's the problem. They need to go into the market.
But Jordy, what he's saying is that he's not receiving RFQs. So if nobody's asking him for the product.
So even more in my side, if you are not receiving RFQs, it means the people is purchasing in the supermarket, the CP, and they cannot get that, right?
Well, they might be fine with it too.
Okay.
Well, actually, I'm having customers that are not fine. That's the reason I did that.
Okay.
And some of them spoken in the mailing list.
I'm going to cap the line for the mic as it stands, including virtual. Go ahead, Eric.
I can defer to Fernando if he wants to.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Hi there. Can you listen to me?
Yeah.
Well, the comment that I wanted to make was that regarding disabling transition technologies or not, there should be a way to disable them, because if you don't, even if you're not actively using them, that still increases the attack surface. So I think it's important to have the option to disable them, even more in the long term. If you expect V6 only, V6 only traffic or a V6 only network, you don't want to have that code on there.
Okay. We can find a way, the draft, to say something about that.
Eric Line. I didn't see in the document a changes from 7084 section. You have a changes from slide.
So you want to have that in the document?
It's very
Easy.
handy. For somebody
Okay,
who's
that's
familiar with
often
it.
done. Yeah.
Yeah,
Perfect.
it's pretty common.
No problem.
Secondly, it looks like all of the transition technologies are should. So if I were a router vendor, I would just still go through and cherry pick the things that I want to implement. Since everything is should, nothing is must, I'll do whatever the heck I want.
One of the questions I made in the mailing list is we want to have them as a must, and the noise I heard was no. So I can ask again in the mailing list if we want to change that.
Right. So this is another laundry list of features, and you can say somebody who implements none of them can still comply with this document, which is right. And the sorry, the comment from Dave Taylor was they'll treat it the same as the May. And the last thing I wanted to say was somewhat unrelated, although I'd like to make a controversial statement and suggest that we just stop with the IPv6 inside of v4 in some way, recommending that kind of stuff. There are enough significant IPv6 deployments, IPv6 native deployments, where v4 may be native or not. Let's just, I mean, at some point we should push that and stop with the, oh, you can use your legacy v4 infrastructure and have v6 as a hobbled second-class citizen. I realize that there's lots of plant installed, and we need to get over that,
but I don't think that's a comment appropriate for this document, in the sense that I am not.
No, in this document, what that would mean was remove 6 and 4, remove 6RD, remove everything where v4 is native and v6 is.
So you want the end users not be able to use IPv4 devices in their home anymore?
No, that's not that at all. That's v4 is provided through other, so v6 is native and transition mechanisms.
Okay, so you want to remove 6RD, for example?
At some point.
Okay.
Yes.
I suggested that, and the answer I got
IPv4 only access links.
Okay. Barbara don't like that, I think. Okay, I understood from the, okay.
James Woodyack, Google. I support a couple of things that I wanted to say I support. One, Eric is, I think, right. We should probably stop saying that you should implement technologies that put 6 inside 4 on IPv4 only first mile links. That ought to be may. And 2, I think it's really important that the working group adopt a revision to RFC 7084. It's a little dated, and I know that I have further inputs to give as soon as it's adopted as a working group item, so I'm pretty sure that it's not ready for last call yet. One particular area where I know I'm going to have further inputs is that a bunch of work was done related to port control protocol since RFC 6092, the simple security draft, and since, I think even since 7084. And I think that a lot of the language around port control protocol could be tweaked and improved, and that's what I'd like to see this draft. I mean, that's the main reason I want to see this draft published, is to improve some of that. And also, I'm interested to see if there's going to be anybody who's going to object to adding the HNCP agent.
At the moment, it's there.
I know it's in the draft, but I'm waiting to see somebody to object to it so that I can go stand in front of them and glare at them.
Okay.
Sorry.
Jen Linkova, someone who was looking for CPs on the supermarkets. I searched through the document. I could not see any mentioning of NAT 6.4.
Which one?
NAT 6.4. Support for those.
NAT 6.4 in the CP?
Yes. I was playing with OpenWRT, doing this at home, and I would love to go and be able to buy that stuff, like on supermarket. There are public DNS 6.4s around, right? So if I configure my devices with public DNS 6.4, why?
I see your point, but I personally see NAT 6.4 as a service that should be provided by the ISP, not the CP.
Why? It might be, right?
Yeah. We can talk later about that if you want. Maybe I am missing some scenario.
So Ole Trøan. So with this shopping list, unless you make this draft have an expiry date reasonably soon in the future, you're making it very hard for me to build IPv6 only routers.
Because they have to support.
Because you have a long shopping list of IPv4 requirements.
Ian Farrer. So working for a large operator and being involved with CPEs there, we use 7084 all the time. So it's not just something that is useful to small vendors. We use this is the benchmark of, we'll start from there, makes everyone's life easier. So updates to this that include softwares and those kind of stuff, very, very useful. Second point around turning the functions off. They're off by default. They have to be enabled by being provisioned by the operator. If you don't send config, it doesn't do them. RFC 8026, I think, gives a mechanism for interworking these things if you have several that you want to support. So there's a lot of options there, and I think
I included that in the document.
8026 went into there, but this stuff's off by default. If you don't want it, if you don't use it, don't configure the clients for it.
Okay. So I'm sure we have more commentary. I'm going to suggest we take it to the list. We've already taken quite a bit of time here. But there clearly seems to be some excitement around this draft, positive and negative. I heard several comments supporting the draft. And let me ask, Jordy would like to take this as a working group draft. If you would like to see it as a working group draft, please hum. If you would like it to not be a working group draft, please hum. Okay, so I'll include that in my email about that. And obviously, we're not ready for a last call. So if you folks, please make your comments to the list.
It's a way to provocate people.
Well, yeah, whatever. But, okay. So, okay. So, and Fernando, I think you're on next, right?
Okay. Can you hear me?
No.
We hear you fine.
Awesome.
Be sure to stand in the and talk.
I'm Fernando Gond. I'll be presenting the document on the dynamic and automatic configuration of IPv6 host. We came up with this document after experiencing in different groups discussions about problems when it comes to supporting the configuration of DNS servers. Okay, next slide. So essentially, as you all know, there are two possible ways to configure DNS information. One is RDNS option in Slack. The other one is the ACP version 6. Unfortunately, there's different support in different operating systems regarding these options. For example, there are major client operating systems that lack support, for example, for the DHCP version 6 option. There are router implementations that lack support for the RDNS part of Slack. So what happens is that in many scenarios, DNS configuration ends up relying on the DHCP version 4. So you cannot really, convey the DNS server information to all nodes via IPv6, but you do it on IPv4, and obviously, since most networks nowadays are still dual stack, or that doesn't come up as a problem yet. Next slide. So there's obviously a typo in the second line. So what we would like is to not rely on IPv4 for DNS configuration, okay? So we would like, for example, IPv6 only networks to be able to configure the DNS information without having to rely on that information being available via DHCP version 4. As a clarification, we don't care about which protocol ends up being used. So we are not pushing for stateless DHCP version 6 for this or for RDNS. But what we like is that if there's a V6 only network, all nodes can, get the DNS configuration info, which is not the case right now. Next slide. So this is a summary of what's in the current specifications in RFC 6434. Essentially, support for Slack RDNS is required, and support for for stateless DHCP version 6 is optional. And when it comes to RFC 7084, it requires support of both stateless DHCP version 6 and Slack for the CE routers. Next slide. So what our ID does is it describes the problem. I think that's important. Well, before and after, working on this document, I was talking to quite a few operators about what they were doing regarding, DNS server configuration. And in most cases, it just works for them, but that's just because, that information is currently being provided via the DHCP version 4. However, if eventually DHCP version 4 is turned off, obviously that problem will become evident. So our ID describes the problem, obviously, and then it formally requires supporting hosts for the RDNS option and for stateless DHCP version 6, and also requires support in routers for the RDNS option. There have been cases, and I think some folks had commented on the V6OPS mailing list where folks were meaning to convey the DNS information via the Slack RDNS option, but there wasn't support in the routers that they were employing, and the involved vendors even had no plans for incorporating that support. Next slide. So, comments?
Okay, Tim Chown. So first of all, Fernando, I think it's really cool as a security man. You seem to be presenting from a darkened bunker 1,000 feet underground. It's, in terms of the draft, you mentioned 6434. That's obviously is informational currently. We are, however, in the process of updating it. Currently, it says nodes should support our DNS option in RAs. It doesn't say must. What we're going to be proposing tomorrow in 6-man is that that's changed to a must. And if that happens, I think that sort of obsoletes the need to produce this document if the new 6434 BIS is a BCP rather than informational, which we could argue as well now that we're 11 years after the first version of it was written. And I think I also heard support from John when he presented on router requirements about making it a must as well on the router side for host-facing subnets too. So this document might be superfluous, but but it might be not necessary.
I agree.
Tim Winters, UNH IOL. So I have two comments. One, DNS in the RA for enterprise routers in particular is not widely deployed. I think last I checked, 3 out of 10 on average, about 30% of our enterprise routers support it today. Obviously newer ones support it, but there's a ton out there that won't do it, don't do it. The other thing I wanted to talk about was 7084. The way the requirement's written now is all routers will support DNS in RAs, but they won't all support stateless. They'll either do stateless or stateful. So the document's a little wrong that way. It's not a huge deal. It's still DHCP, so it doesn't, I don't think it's going to affect anything, but it is just a clarity point.
Well, so let me ask you a question. If only 3 out of 10 routers support RDNS,
yep.
Is this document stating a direction we wish the other 7 did?
Well,
or is it trying to describe the current state of affairs?
Yeah, that's a good question for Fernando. The current state of affairs is it's not widely deployed with the exception of CE routers. Oddly enough, the home gateways do this, but the enterprise routers do not.
And do we want the enterprise routers to?
See a lot of nodding
Barbara
heads.
says yes. Okay, so I see, okay, fine.
Dave Taylor, I was going to make a similar comment. I think there's an error on one of the slides, which was the one you were talking about with the 7084. 7084, your slide said that it only required SLAC. 7084 explicitly says that the CE router must be able to support the following DHCP V6 options. That includes the DNS servers option. And so the router requirements actually does mandate both as musts right now. And so that slide was an error. Otherwise, I thought it was okay. The discussion that V6OPS had a long time ago was because both of them have been mandatory in routers for some time, then there wasn't a huge incentive to get hosts to do the second one of the two, right? Because the routers would already have to support both of them anyway. And so it's fine to say that, but the things you want to change are like older hosts, and I don't know if the older hosts are going to change. You could potentially make requirements for new ones, but the goal you were trying to solve is to make sure that there's an interoperability path, right? And the current status quo is routers must do both. Hosts can pick or choose because the router has to do both. And hopefully the world will get better and get more convergence, but that's just the status quo. So,
John Brzezowski, Comcast. So, Fred, the drafts we talked about earlier when I was up front, we tried to touch on the enterprise side of things, right? So that's just generic router requirements. The other thing about the drafts, Fernando, is to me it seems like requiring stateless DHCP6 is a little overkill, right? I'd like to suggest that the base recommendation is RDNSS, and then the extension that is, and I'll have to go back and double check the draft itself. I think we want to make sure that both the search list and the IP address for the DNS server are both included. I know that I've almost forgot that a couple of times in some of the conversations I've had for stuff that we're working on that front. So it's worth saying them both specifically, otherwise they'll get missed.
James Woodyoung, Google. I'd like to echo what John just said about making sure that the DNS search list gets mentioned explicitly so that people don't miss that. So I've said this on the list. I'm still not all that excited about making a mandatory requirement on hosts to implement the stateless DHCP6 client. If it could be dropped, I would be happiest. But if it cannot be dropped, then I think I would really want to insist that we get very smart in some document that says when both are available, you must use the RA, RDNSS information to the exclusion of DHCP6 client provided information, unless there's no RDNSS information in the RAs. Would I standardize a document that says use DHCP6 stateless? And
I can't hear you, Lorenzo.
I think I would object. The new RDNSS document says that, and I missed it. Oh wow, I'm going to go cry.
Bree?
General, someone who operates the network. I slightly disagree with your problem statement. You saying that, okay, hosts do not support DHCP and routers do not support RDNSS. And what I'm observing is that some operating systems do not support RDNSS. Quite a lot of routers do, but I could not use it because there are some operating systems around which I could not get DNS information from array. I think the problem statement was, first problem is host, the lack of DHCP support on host, and the second problem is routers. Could you go to the problem statement slide, please? Different major router implementations like support for Slack RDNSS. So I'm confused why we saying it's routers problem. So yeah, I believe we should fix hosts by making sure they all support RDNSS. Yeah, and we can make sure that routers support RDNSS, and I think it was on drafts which we already discussed and some problem solved. So I think, yes, this draft, okay, maybe.
Jen, there was a post by Microsoft from a guy from Microsoft on IPv6 only, and exactly the problem that they were having was that they were trying to convey the DNS information via RDNS option, but the router that they were employing had no support for it. So that's exactly why we included that in the problem statement and also in the requirements.
The blog post to which you refer also said that they had code in hand that did it. So that's not a valid thing, I think.
And that was Lorenzo Coliti, and I'm Julius Krobacek, and I would like to say something that is probably obvious for everyone in this room that deserves being repeated. Adding RDNSS, if you're already sending router advertisements, is 7 lines of C code, including error handling. A little bit more if you implement that in assembler.
Yeah, Lorenzo Coliti, that's in addition to Julius's point, it's you must already have RA processing, because otherwise it doesn't work, right? And you can't talk to anything off link, and sort of that's typically not useful for either a router or a host, right? You have to have an RA, you have to have code to send RAs, or have to have code to receive RAs. So once you have that code, you might as well add RDNSS to it. Another thing that I would say is that stateless DHCP6 is not as capable as RDNSS, because you can't update anything, because there's this like minimum 10-minute time. There's a minimum 10-minute time of the minimum lifetime of the stateless DHCP6 request, and so you can't change anything more often than once every 10 minutes. Which, yes, in an enterprise network, I can see you shrugging your shoulders, is not an issue. But in a home network where you unplug things and you plug them in again, you might want to change things more often than that. So I think if we want to, I would suggest that we should just can the IPv6 stateless DNS options on the basis that the RDNSS option, that the RA has to always be there, and we just remove this debate by saying the IPv6 stateless DNS options are deprecated.
Lorenzo, we are not making any statements regarding what what networks should end up using. So we just want the guy running the network to use whatever option is good for him. That's it.
Nando, you're breaking up really badly. I don't know what the issue is, but we can't understand what you're saying.
I was saying that we don't want to recommend any specific whether to do the HCP version 6 or Slack. We just want to provide the options and for the network to use whatever they want to use.
I understand what you're recommending, but your problem statement is that there's no consistency, and I would say that that problem is best solved by canning the IPv6 stateless and just using RDNSS everywhere. That solves the same problem, and it's a better solution.
Lee Howard, not wearing any hats or dots or anything. I've been spending a lot of time this week thinking about how not all hosts are created equal, and different kinds of devices have different kinds of purposes, and they're therefore different kinds of needs. So I'd like to see at least some qualifying language saying that we're talking about specific kinds of devices used for internet access as opposed to sensor node, sensor client devices, or other kinds of things that are severely constrained, where even adding a fairly few, 7 lines probably not that big a deal. But I have heard of implementations where even 7 lines of code might be a big deal. And I haven't thought through yet the implications of having multiple versions supported on when somebody's living full time on when the whole internet experience. Fred, would you hit the big red button? I don't think there's any impact on battery life, but I'm trying to pay more attention to what the internet looks like for most people in the world. Thanks.
I'm Jim Metatia. I've been watching the discussion, and I've also read this draft. And I think the problem statement is reasonable, and this is an important problem, I think. But on watching the discussion, I see almost unresolvable different views of opinion. So my feeling is that it's probably unrealistic to set a specific requirement after the problem statement. So realistically, the best way forward for this document is to just describe the problem statement, and that's the third thing, but after that, let the market decide. That's my impression.
I'm going to cap the mic after John.
Dave Taylor. So I suspect Jinmei might actually be right, but I got up here just to say that the whole RA versus DHCP discussion comes up in many contexts over and over and over across the last, 15 years or something like that. Not just about the DNS server addresses, where it comes up in configuration of everything. And so there's well-known arguments on both sides that things like, Lorenzo articulated some of the arguments for one of them. Some of the arguments for the other side that I've heard is, well, RA has a fixed size, and so if you start including search lists and things, you start, as well as other options that people want to put in there, then you start running into size limits. And so the point was that, in general, the sort of the lack of consensus that sort of one size fits all is kind of how we got into the mess that we're in right now. So getting rid of one might work for one case and maybe cause problems in another case, and so that's why I said I suspect Jinmei might actually be right. The point that I tried to make earlier when I said, I think it was Barbara missed the point that I was making, which is what you would dictate now doesn't change what old hosts or even old routers would do. Okay. The old hosts might not be updated anymore, right? It might be your printer that's been sitting there for 5 years, or your Windows 7 box that you never got around to upgrading, or your webcam that's no longer being updated, or whatever it is, right? So even if it's supported IPv6, right? So you're not going to change those. They'll do whatever they do. Okay. And so, but the best you can do is say, here's what new things should be doing, and there's some value in doing that. And that's what I was commenting to Fernando. There might be some value in saying, here's what new things should do. But in the meantime, the best we can do is to say, if you're following the existing RFCs, you'd get interoperability. The problem right now is that some people aren't following the existing RFCs, and those RFCs are talking about the router side that have to do both, right? So that was the main point I was trying to make. So.
But by the way, I had capped the mic after John.
Yeah. Sorry. That's John Brzezowski, Comcast. So one point about this line in particular, when we did the unique prefix per host draft, we observed that statement about different OSs doing different things, right? That's why we had to basically turn everything on, right? Except for stateful DHCP6. But one of the things that I can tell you from our experience planning for the new building that we're building in Philadelphia that will be V6 only for end user devices, we're seeing convergence in this space, right? We for one prefer to use RDNSS, right? So we're seeing both hosts of all different, popular types that you'd find in, corporate enterprise networks supporting RDNSS properly. We also find that the routers that are sending the RAs are doing the same, right? So for what it's worth, Fernando, if you're still out there, I mean, we're seeing convergence that way from our point of view. And honestly, Fred, I mean, what the reason for us is we don't want to operate DHCP servers, right? DHCP6 servers, we had plenty before. And don't get me wrong, I've deployed a lot of DHCP, right? Tens of millions of devices use DHCP in my network, right? So it's not that I don't dislike it. I don't have the same, dislike for DHCP as Lorenzo does, right? It's a tool, right? And we have to use the right tool for the right job, right? So, but in this case in particular, we're trying to get away and put as much of the state into the network and not have to operate services on top of them so that we avoid disconnects, right? So from our point of view, we're heading towards that direction. We're seeing a lot of progress in that space. And I don't see a need for us. I just don't see a place where we won't be able to use RDNSS. Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Okay, thank you, John. So now let me kind of come back to the obvious question. We've obviously seen a lot of interest in the draft, both positive and negative in the room. We're ready for some discussion on the mailing list about it, I think. Do you guys want me to take this as a working group draft, or does it take a spin before we think about that? If you think it should be adopted.
Hi, Tim Chandler. The point I made at the end was if we update 64, we are updating 6434. If you put the host side requirements in there, do we actually need this document?
Well, that's kind of the question I'm asking.
Well, I just thought I'd make it more explicit.
Okay. Okay, so if we're not going to adopt it right now, or if we're not going to go down that path, then it's obviously still open to discuss on the mailing list. If the draft is here, we can discuss it. But we'll discuss progressing it at some point in the future, if that becomes the consensus of the draft. So with that, we could go on. We have a couple of drafts that we put on the agenda if we had time, and I think we've got half. So, do we have unhappy eyeballs that need to become happy?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone.
And please stay in the pink box. The Meet Echo people.
This is a very small pink box. I'll do my best.
No, it's the size of 1 foot, I realize.
All right. So my name is David Skenazy. I work at Apple, and this draft was written by Tommy Pauly and myself, and it discusses happy eyeballs, and more specifically, how we've updated or how our implementation has been updated over the years to make it better. And we'd like to show the findings we have, especially with measurement data over hundreds of millions of devices, and see if maybe it's worth updating the RFC for happy eyeballs. So, quick show of hands. Who is in the room has read the draft or quickly skimmed it? Ooh, thanks, people. Awesome. So I'm quickly going to go through mostly the changes from the original happy eyeballs in this draft, and finally we'll talk about what next steps we can take. All right, so the first one is hostname resolution. In the original document, it doesn't really mention how you handle host names. It just says that you got them, and an example, it mentions getOuterinfo. The one big downside of getOuterinfo is that it is a synchronous networking call. And as far as DNS goes, your quad A query and your A query are separate packets, and so are the replies. So you can send them out at the same time, but they'll be coming back as asynchronous packets. So if you actually use a synchronous API, you have to wait for both of them to come back before you can do anything with these addresses. And the big downside here is that if you get your quad A reply and you have an address that's ready to go, you're just sitting there waiting for the A packet. Even though you really want to support IPv6, you're waiting for this IPv4 address that you're never going to use. So, and that delays the whole process, obviously. So simple solution, you use asynchronous DNS. And by that, I just mean when you get the quad A reply, you start your TCP connection, your V6 SYN. You don't wait for the A. And if your A resolver is out to lunch, everything still works great. To be slightly more specific, if you get the quad A first, you start that right away. And if you get the A first, then you don't want to quite start the A right away, because if your host preference selection wants you to do IPv6, you have to wait a little bit. Right now, we've configured this as a 50 millisecond timer, meaning that if during these 50 milliseconds you get the quad A, then you fire that off. But if you don't, then you don't want to wait forever in the case that your DNS server is out to lunch. Why is this really critical? It actually turns out that DNS does time out or cause retransmissions very, very often. I'll back that up with numbers very soon. And also, doing asynchronous DNS really isn't that hard. If you're a single-threaded C application that only uses synchronous networking calls, you can't do IP eyeballs in the first place. It's an asynchronous machinery. So either you use a platform that has asynchronous DNS APIs, there are good open source ones like GetDNS that are being worked on, or you can just do that with 2 threads and get header info if that's the last thing you have. So some measurements here, and these are across so Apple currently has over 1 billion active devices. This is across a good chunk of them. And if we want to do a DNS question, how many packets does it take before we get a reply? So 0 means it was in the local cache. And so a lot of the times it's 0 or 1, but as you can see, very often it takes a retransmission. And that for us is 1 or 2 seconds. So your user is waiting there, instead of connecting to your website, they're just watching the spinny. And sometimes it takes even 3 or more. One thing that's kind of troubling about this that I just noticed when we pulled the data together last week was that looks like V6 resolution is really worse than V4, so we're really looking into that. Don't make assumptions just yet. Another one is if you look at it more as a CDF, you can see that there's a real big bump around 1 second, which is our timeout. So it really does happen, and it's like between 5 and 10% of the time, you have to wait over 1 second for a DNS reply. All right, moving on to the underlying DNS transport. So DNS has A and quad A queries, but also DNS packets are sent over UDP over IP. So I'm not talking about AOQI, I'm talking about the IP version down there. We really recommend that you send your DNS queries over IPv6 if that works. The main reason for that is some providers that are in this room are actually deploying networks where you will have a V6 DNS server closer to your home, but the V4 one will be much further out, like if you're deploying V6 only backbones with MAP, for example. Now that we have this pile of addresses, what do we do with it? So we sort them. Luckily, we have tools to do that. Our C6724 has destination address selection. So that tells you if you have 2 addresses, which one's best. So that allows you to sort the list. And one cool thing that's in that RFC is that it allows you to add your custom rules between role 8 and role 9. And since our platform has some historical data and statistics measurements from our previous connections, we use those. So for example, we measure, like in the routing table, we have the RTT of previous connections. And given 2 equally nice addresses, we pick the one with the lower latency. Also, if we have one that we used recently, we pick that first because a lot of features like TFO or some HTTP cookies will work better if you keep hitting the same server. So now that you have a pretty list of addresses, so on that you land with what you have on the left here. But if you were to only walk through this and you had a really long list of quad A records and V6 was hopelessly broken, you would be waiting a very long time. So to avoid that, you just grab your first address from the second address family, so in this case V4, and just dump it in second and third place. That way the user doesn't have to wait too long. Then once you've done that, it's really simple. You just walk the entire list of addresses. So the key difference here with the Happy Eyeballs RFC is that it only discusses running the first 2. And it turns out this makes a difference. You really want to go through all of them. And a simple way to do this is to start the next attempt when you feel like you there's something wrong with the first one. So in our stack, that's the mean times 4 times the standard deviation of the RTT. And it also coincides with how our TCP stack sends SYN retransmissions. So if you sent your first SYN, after a while you go, I really should have gotten a SYNAC by now, and you're about to send a second SYN, you send that second SYN, but at the same time you kick off the next connection. And that way you stagger them. If you, in the absence of historical data, we set a default of 250 milliseconds. The reason this matters is, so most of the time we do end up using the first or second address, but there is a long tail, we end up using the other ones. I only did 3+ here, but we have numbers all the way to 12. So we really don't know what happened to that poor person. They must have been waiting for a while. All right, so one thing to note is that since we're doing asynchronous DNS, but even in the absence of that, your your list is dynamic. You can get more replies. So in this example, like if the A response comes in later, but also if you're using some DNS features like long-lived queries or DNS push, you can get additions later on. Also, if like the TTL expires, some addresses in your list can be no longer valid anymore. So pretty simple, when you get a new address, you just sort it into the existing list. If one is removed, you remove it from the list unless you've already started it, because you don't want to pull the rug under an address that might be perfectly healthy. Or if like you're actually connected and everything, you just want to go, nope, you're done because there's no TTL. And that's all there is to it, really. So the questions we have for the working group is, is anyone here interested? What do we want to do with this? And also, does anyone have questions about any of this? Before I answer all the questions,
There's obviously no opinion in the room.
all right, great. And before, so the 3 possibilities that have been outlined to me are, one, we can update the current RF 6555, so we would have another standards track document that obsoletes the previous one, or we could have a new standard with a different name. I've heard people don't like the name Happy Eyeballs. Fred had already taken Happier Eyeballs, so someone suggested Happiest Eyeballs. Not a huge fan. Or we can make this informational about what Apple is doing, but that would be sad in my opinion. All right, Jen.
Jen Linko, Google. I like it. I have one clarification question. So you say that a client should prefer IPv6 DNS servers. What I observed in real life is that there are implementations which, for example, can receive 3 or 4 DHCP v4 DNS servers from, let's say, DHCP v4, and then a number of v6 DNS servers from RDNSS. And some implementations have a limit on how many DNS servers even using anyway, right? So let's say it might be 3, so they're picking up randomly 3. Do you want to also provide guidance on implementations that they should, if they have to pick up only 3 out of 8, should they pick up only first 3 v6, or do they need to balance and pick up like v4 and v6 DNS servers to use?
So our implementation doesn't have such a limitation. So yeah, we definitely shouldn't do that, especially given that a DNS entry is like 16 bytes. So we can add that to the document. That sounds great.
Yeah, because it's a problem I've seen in real life.
Okay,
so
yeah.
I'm just curious if
Yeah.
this document probably, because it's already says something about that.
I agree. Please email the list. We'll add it to the next revision.
Jeff Houston. Firstly, instead of happy eyeballs, you might consider esotropia. Crossed eyeballs.
I like it.
Secondly, you probably haven't changed your TCP SYN timeouts, which means that once you try a connection attempt, you go through this exponential back off with SYNs. For many stacks, it's 70. For Windows, it was 21 seconds. For a lot of stacks, and I think Apple was one of them, it's 75. Some Linux, it's closer to 3 minutes. Now, if I have, say, 12 addresses, A's and quad A's, and you're going to go through the lot of that, times 3 minutes seems an awfully long time, longer than I'm willing to wait. So my question is, if you're going to alter the way in which and the intensity at which you're going to try connections, shouldn't you be more aggressive about cutting off the underlying TCP connection algorithm earlier, rather than having this long state persistence going, I think I'm on a modem, I'm going to wait for half an hour and try a SYN again. because the two don't seem to work well for the user. If you're going to try a lot, shorten it down to just a couple of seconds and then move on to another address rather than just pound and pound and
So
wait.
in this case, we reuse the same picture as what the kernel stack does, but we don't have the backoff for this. So we end up staggering them. Also, we have bounds on this on this timeout. And so like, even if your RTT is blazingly fast, we don't want to wait less than 100 milliseconds. And if it's horribly slow, we don't want to wait more than 1 second.
Okay, thank you.
But you're absolutely right. Yeah, you can. 3 minutes, no.
Okay, let me stick in a chair's comment here. If the line gets any longer, it will be out the door. So at this point, I'm going to cap the line. Sorry, go ahead.
We must have done something really right or really wrong.
Jim Metatia, could you go back to the previous slide? My understanding that this long-lived queries and DNS push are not documented in the current version of the draft. Is that correct?
In our current draft?
Yeah.
I thought it was one of the things that we added in the second revision in -01 that we put.
Okay. Yeah, I'm asking this because this is probably related to one thing I didn't understand. The dynamic nature of the getting answers after trying the connection, even after getting the both A and quad A answers. I guess it's related to this feature. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, okay. So I don't know if the very latest version already talk about it, but if not, please add that. That will help me and hopefully some others understand it very well.
Okay, yeah, if there's anything we need to clarify, yeah, please read the latest one. Otherwise, please come and talk to me after or email me. If it's unclear in the draft, we definitely want to fix that.
Thank you.
Lorenzo Coletti, first of all, I mean, I have no sympathy for people who think you can use getOutterInfo and actually do anything useful. I mean, if you can use getOutterInfo, you can be fast, but you have to pick one of the two. So with that out of the way. As for the, do you want to go back to the options? One thing here is, one thing here is I think the situation is, what you have is really good for internet access, but I seem to recall that every time the Chrome team tries to use their internal asynchronous DNS resolver, they trip up because Windows has all these special cases and it hooks down to NetBIOS and everything. It becomes very, very, very complicated. And particularly one thing that people always seem to get tripped up over is how do you do A versus quad A fallback with, with search paths? And how does that interaction work? And it's always like, oh, we don't know how to do this. We'll just call getOutterInfo and we'll be at least covered. We'll say, well, it was somebody else's fault. So that gets very complicated. So that
well, we don't recommend running your own DNS stack because, as you say, that is hard. If you run on a modern operating system like that, it may have asynchronous DNS APIs that just work. And like you were saying, if you don't just run a getOutterInfo with the A, one with the quad A, don't roll your own. This is hard.
Yeah, but my point is, right, if you're an app like Chrome, then you want to do this, you should have, if we want to give guidance on how an implementation should work, if Chrome wants to build this or some other browser wants to build this, then, that's a hard problem. And, maybe you can just punt and say, well, this is a hard problem, just call the OS, or say that the OS, what the OS needs to provide. On this other point, on the next steps, I think I don't like the Happy Eyeballs name. I think it's associated with falling back from V6 to V4, and that's not. This is just much more. So, I mean, as for standards track, I mean, it kind of depends how much detail is in this document. Because if this document ends up being a description of the Apple implementation, you might get sort of people disagreeing with you if you've already seen with getOutterInfo, and you might not be able to make any progress. So another way is, clearly informational is probably easier. It sort of depends if we can cut it into something that's generic enough to be a standards track document.
Yeah. Ideally, yeah, we want to, that's our first goal, to cut it to something that we get consensus on. 3 as a fallback in case that doesn't work with a reasonable timeout.
So I think
Looks like my co-author wants to say something.
Let me stick a word in here that I think might be helpful. One of the complaints that I had with Dan Wing's document and Andrew Yurchenko's document was that they were describing a multi-homed environment and an application in it. And by multi-homed, I could mean 20 IPv4 addresses, 20 IPv6 addresses, or any mixture of the above. And the point is that it had to somehow make a choice. And I think the document becomes dramatically simpler if you, one, move away from the web, it's an application. Two, just say, listen, I've got lots of addresses and somehow I have to make a choice. A whole lot of text suddenly disappears, I think.
I think this document is shorter
in
than
that regard. I think it becomes an obsolete next step for happy eyeballs and probably a better document.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to chime in, Tommy Pauly, the other co-author on this. I don't think we want this to just be, this is Apple's implementation. From what Apple does for happy eyeballs, I think we want to do whatever the whole community thinks is truly the best thing to do. I don't think we want to compromise on things like asynchronous DNS because I think that actually has benefit. But if there are other things that we don't do or we should do differently, that should be in this draft and we should change it and make it be what everyone thinks is best and then we'll adopt it. So it's not inflexible.
That's great. I think the problem with standards track is that the bar is really high, and if somebody disagrees with you, you're dead, right? Because if they disagree with you and you don't budge, you're dead. So one final comment. Do you talk about MTU issues? Because that's really hard to do in any current Happy Eyeballs implementation, and that's actually the remaining problem that needs to be solved. And maybe you say that it's a problem that's out of scope, or what do you say now?
We don't say anything now. I feel like that's out of scope because...
Should probably say that it's out of scope, though.
Sure, we can add that. Please email the list.
Hi there, John Wojciechowski, Comcast. So I think it's really good work, honestly.
Thank you.
I know we talked about this on a couple occasions, and I think as the properties of V4 change on the internet today, the things that make it work have to change with it, right? They'll have to grow up a little bit, a lot of it, right? Actually. So for what it's worth, I'd be happy to, be a reviewer and send you some, do better than a skim, right? Because I confess, I've kind of paged through it, but we've had a number of conversations.
Let the minutes show that John committed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from this slide's point of view, I'd like to see, with the changes to V4 come changes to the DNS, right? There's a lot of stuff that we're looking at doing as well. Making sure that we recurse properly over V6 to authoritative name servers and such. So there's a lot of plumbing that's being changed, whether people want to acknowledge it or not, right? So part of me wants to basically see the first option, be the case, the standards track component, because then it becomes a lot more well-known and predictable, right? I worry less about, Lorenzo's comment's valid. I worry less about it because after the day's done, if there's kind of baseless resistance, we're going to do it anyway, right? So off we go. So, so I think from that point of view, I think there's, it's important that we have something to kind of, that the people can kind of model their implementation after. I appreciate Tommy's comment about, the lack of inflexibility. That's good to know, right? Yeah. And then from our point of view, I think, we've chased a lot of things like this in production, often, right? So having something a little bit more predictable, a lot more predictable would be very useful from a consumer's point of view and an operator's point of view. Thanks.
Jordi Palet. I think happy eyeballs is bad in general, in the following sense. It's good for the users, but because the ISPs don't get reports that something is broken in IPv6, well, this is what I see in real networks in customers. Yeah, I operate some networks for customers. So I will agree in this document in going to standards track, but having some way of defining an expiry date. I don't know if that's possible in the standards track, but I think that's the way to go because we don't have an equivalent situation for IPv4. If IPv4 is broken, it's broken. If IPv6 is broken, it's broken. And the user need to be able to tell the call center of his ISP is not working.
So I totally agree with you that one of the downsides of Happy Eyeballs is it hides V6 brokenness. However, if your network is broken, my customer shouldn't have to deal with it. That's not his job. He's not a tester. You don't pay him. So you should have a way to figure out if your network is broken.
I see your point, but I think we need to find some balance. So at a given point, maybe in 1 year from now, 2 years from now, we can withdraw Happy Eyeballs.
Oh, we have already done that. You just remove the V4. Deploy V6 only.
Good.
Okay, we're 6 minutes before the top of the hour. Let's keep comments.
Hi, this is James Woodya, Google. I'm generally in favor of improving this document because as your friendly neighborhood machine-to-machine guy, I think that there are lots of things that don't have any eyeballs that would be a lot happier if we had more responsive connectivity as a general platform feature in operating systems. So I see the principal value of this draft being that it specifically stands up and says the way you get better responsiveness is by doing concurrent locating and connecting at the same time. I had an evil idea while I was waiting in line, which is that 50 millisecond timer. How about we just write an algorithm that says that actually it's 50 milliseconds plus 10 milliseconds for every month after January 1, 2018.
So I don't like putting what you call time bombs in the code because then when it breaks, people call me. But with every release, we can modify this, and these are defining the document specifically as numbers that can be configured.
Well, if you won't go that far, well, let's at least say that the minimum is 50 milliseconds and that others can use larger ones.
That sounds reasonable to me.
And I would like to suggest that if you rename this to be something that doesn't talk about high balls, because things that don't have eyes care about this, use the word concurrent and locating and connecting in the title.
We'll do our best to come up with a cool name. If anyone has good ideas, please email the list.
Dave Taylor, 2 comments. First of all, thank you for writing this up. This is a good presentation. Appreciate that. The first comment is that came up while I was in line, so it's not what I got up to talk about, but about various APIs. I will mention that the APIs that people typically cite that are the standard ones are not the ones that are in use in what you might call modern OSs, right? A couple of years ago, Stuart and I actually gave a joint presentation, I think it was the PCP BOF, about things like connect by name APIs and so on that are fairly popular for people to write to in APIs that are not standard, right? And so I agree with what David said, and we do the same thing. We have the same type of APIs in Windows. But the reason that I got up to specifically say that is because the people that do APIs, like the POSIX API, is the Austin group that's part of SC22 and ISO. And the current closest thing that we have to a liaison with that group is me. And so if the IETF actually wants to say something to the group that actually owns those standards, let me know, and I'm happy to pass that on. We don't have an official liaison person, but I'm the only person that's kind of in common between the IETF lists and their mailing lists. And so if there's something we want to say informally, I'm the person that would be happy to say that. What I actually got up here to say, unless you got any comment on that.
So yeah, thanks for offering that. One thing I want to shamelessly plug Tommy's work with a bunch of other smart people in TAPS, which is called post sockets. And the idea is to come up with smart APIs.
Fair enough. Just
in the
solicit,
IETF.
if anybody has APIs they'd like to draw to the attention of the C++ standards community, send them to me and I'm happy to post them to the list to draw their attention. That's just a general ad. Okay, what I actually got up to say is I can't actually tell yet whether updating 6555 is important or not. And so I was going to ask you to elaborate, not necessarily now, but maybe in a copy of the draft or whatever, which is 6555 doesn't actually specify an algorithm. It specifies requirements for algorithms. And we already see different variations of RFC 6555 compliant algorithms. Okay, so Windows and Apple are both conformant to that, but they're slightly different algorithms. Okay, and so what I can't tell is whether your update here actually is non-compliant, in which case you'd want to update it, okay, potentially, or if you've learned that there should be additional general requirements added to that list of requirements. It would also be useful regardless of which algorithm that you're using, right? So the current IETF consensus is to not specify an algorithm, but specify requirements for algorithms and allow a little bit of variation if you can find some way to innovate and add yet another update in your next rev and not have to rev the RFC, right? So what I couldn't tell is if you actually wanted to change the requirements, and that I would need to tell before I could actually answer the first question. Documenting it, good. Updating 6555, can't tell yet.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we should clarify that. I agree with the point that in general we should describe requirements and then possibly an example of what we do. I totally agree. We should rephrase that.
Okay, so at this point, we are actually over time, so please be quick.
All right, I'll be quick. Igor Gashinsky, Yahoo. First of all, thank you. This is great work.
Thanks.
So my one question on, you provide a example algorithm here, basically with some sample timers. I would prefer not to be back here every year or every IETF tweaking those knobs.
Totally agree with you.
So it would be good if we had a good way of suggesting, just literally suggesting that the knobs get tweaked over time, but not actually have to tweak them every.
Sounds good. And James' proposal of a minimum value goes in that direction. We'll incorporate that.
But this is awesome. Absolutely, why don't you?
Thanks.
Igor Lubashev, Kamai. First of all, thanks for sharing your experience with the community. Very valuable. Now, one thing that you talked about, what you do in response to DNS, and say if address disappears, you say, well, you're not going to yank carpet out of existing connection. Actually, it could have disappeared for a reason, and I'm worried if you can continue using the same connection for a long time, especially if it's a pecan that you just have it idle. I would rather something in the document say that you need to try to reestablish connection to valid addresses, at least after some timer.
So one thing we've noticed, coming from people who use, and I think Akamai is in that club, of using DNS for load balancing, the addresses come and go. It doesn't mean that the server died. So because we had a bug in the implementation where we were indeed pulling it out and it led to bad customer experience. So if you have more details, I think that we can clarify that in the document.
We should work together on that, but sometimes we yank the address for a good reason.
Awesome, I agree.
Eric Nygren, great work. I like this. I think I think one thing that may be worth considering is scope-wise. Also, is V6OPS the right place for this? Like, I think it makes sense to do some of this, but I think a bunch of these questions here are ones where are important ones where we want to be coordinating with DNSOP to make sure that, for example, some of the work they're doing to be able to do A and quad A queries in parallel is something we might fold in here whenever the appropriate time is. You should use that when available. But where some of these questions about what sort of how to vary the timers between there so you don't end is an important one to actually get right, because if you're not careful on that, you can very quickly enter into congestive collapse if you just have a increasingly aggressive fixed timeouts for retrying things, or questions of how long to retain DNS connections to a DNS name that's expired, which is something which I think is an important question, but is probably a broader topic than just a V6OPS topic.
Okay, thank you. And Fernando has been standing in line, so let's get Fernando.
I think you press twice and got him out. All right, please twice again.
Yeah.
Fernando, we can see you.
Yeah, I was saying that at times this is portrayed as a problem that is V6 specific, but actually this is a problem that happens, whether you only have V4, mix it V4 and V6, or even V6 only. So I think this is a general problem. And another thing I wanted to comment on that, when you start talking about, TCP timeouts and so on, probably TCPM should get involved.
Fair enough. No, I totally agree with you on both these points. Please take them to the list.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone, for the questions.
Any further discussion, let's take it out in the hall or take it to the list. And I'll be asking for adoption or not adoption on the list anyway. And so we're done at this point. Thank you. I don't think at this point we can you unplug it?